So now we're going to go from the basic software renderer to using the physical lighting, physically correct Arnold renderer, which is very, very cool. Something that was new in Maya, I want to say in 2017. It's only been around a couple of years, but it's one of the best kind of industry standard, industrial strength, photorealistic renderers out there, which is why it connected into Maya. For years, Maya had a renderer called Mental Ray inside of it. There's lots of different renderers out there. Pixar has their own renderer that they created, and they call it RenderMan. But this Arnold renderer seems to be one of the latest and greatest, which is why it's the default now in Maya. So before we set that up, the first thing is just set up a new scene to work with. So I'm just going to go save scene as, and instead of basic lighting, I'm going to go to, I'll call it physical lighting. All right, so I've got a basic lighting set up with basic materials and basic software rendering. And now we're going to have physical lighting, which is all going to use Arnold. So we've got this set up. I would like to delete some things. I want to start out by getting rid of all three of our lights. So select all three of your lights and delete them. I end up with this blackness, so I'm actually going to click the 6 key, which will take me out of showing lights so I at least see my objects. All right, leave my camera, leave all my objects. The other thing I'm going to delete right now is my materials, because when we use Arnold, not only is Arnold have its own renderer, but Arnold also has its own materials. And we're going to end up using the same material in a bunch of different ways, which I'll show you. But we're going to start with very, very basic so you can see the lighting effects first, and then we'll grow into the materials. So to get rid of these materials, first off, I'm going to go ahead and select all 4 of my objects, and then right-click them and choose Assign Existing Material and assign Lambert 1. Which is the default material that everything started with, back to this grayness. We're gonna give it a new one, but for right now, I wanna undo what we had done in the other scene. Select that back to Lambert 1, so everything's the same. I can deselect, I've got my basic shapes here. And then I want to get rid of those materials, and to do that, let's open up the Hypershade, which is, again, that dialog box that shows up with this little shader ball that's right next to the rendering settings. And you can see that in the Hypershade, it's showing us all of our different, it's showing us our cube matte, our room matte, our torus matte, and our sphere matte. And as you click them, you can actually see how they're being affected on this shader ball. You can play with all the stuff a little more advanced than just in the attribute editor. But really, we want to delete these. Why can't I just, okay, yeah, I can just use delete. So I'm just selecting each of these 4 materials one at a time and getting rid of them. Okay, so what I end up with is just these 4 that come with Maya. Lambert 1, Particle Cloud, Shader Glow 1, and the standard Surface 1. It's a newer material, but we're gonna use the Arnold version anyway. So clear that stuff out, remove Hypershade, and what we're basically back to is before we set up any lighting or materials, we have our render room with our objects, our cube is smoothed, and we've got our camera all set up. I'm gonna go ahead and hit save. Click on your render settings and change it from Maya software to Arnold renderer. If you do not see the Arnold renderer, let me show you how to install it. All right, I'm gonna hit close. The Arnold renderer is a plugin. There are a lot of plugins for Maya. In fact, there are a lot of plugins that come with Maya that by default are not turned on. So for whatever reason this one wasn't turned on, let's see, make sure you've got it, and if not, we may need to look at some installation. But you can go to the plugin manager. So go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, and then Plugin Manager. And that will open up this plugin manager. And what this is this is a big long list of plugins that can get loaded into Maya. And a lot of them are already loaded, and basically you can set to whether they're loaded or auto load, which means they're going to automatically load up on, when it runs. So you can see it, there's a whole bunch of plugins that aren't even loaded by default. Specifically this Bullet, that's a physics engine, which I'll get in and show you some dynamic physics at some point when we get into animation. We'll add in this Bullet physics engine and see how that works. But the Arnold is actually a kind of an obscure name. It is the M2A. Let's see, where do I see it there? Because it's further down here. Here it is. Okay, so it is this M2A.bundle, and it's under Application Autodesk Arnold M2A, and you just have to make sure that's loaded and auto load. And if you've got this M2A bundle, then you can hit close, and you're good to go. With the Arnold renderer, first off, we're going to set up, we're just going to render without anything and see that it's black. But even though it's black and there's absolutely nothing rendering, let's let it finish. It took 11 seconds. All right. So right away, do I still have the other one saved? Yeah, I do still have these other ones saved here. It took 11 full seconds to render. And this one, our most complicated one with ray tracing, took 10 seconds to render. And this one doesn't even have anything but black. As soon as we start adding things, it's going to go up exponentially. So again, this is the major thing, is being able to play with these settings and get things dialed up high enough to give you good quality, but you're always going to have to weigh the time you have to render against the rendering engine and technique that you're using. Now with Arnold, we actually have a completely different set. It's one of the interesting things in Maya because it's been around so long. Just like there's NURBS modeling kind of along with the polygon modeling, the Arnold renderer has its own render view. So technically I can click this render view and open this up and see what's rendering, but the Arnold render view is actually a little better. We do still use the same settings menu, the render settings menu. As long as we're set to the Arnold renderer, we're good to go. But under Arnold up here, and let's see, is that in modeling and rendering? Yeah, so whether we're in modeling or rendering, we have this Arnold drop down up here. All right, I'm gonna go back to modeling. And in the Arnold dropdown, we've got this open Arnold render view and render. I believe clicking render will just open the Arnold render view, which it does. And it says it's rendering. We don't see it doing the little blocks. We see it with this percentage down here. So again, it's just rendering black. We haven't added any lights yet. We can see the percentage building, and it took 14 seconds. All right, so again, this is already like 30–40% slower than our most complex scene, and we haven't even rendered anything yet, right? And we're not even in good quality yet, but we'll get to that. So one important thing is, yes, we do use a different render view, this Arnold render view. There's a couple of different advantages to it, and I'll show you. But before we worry about that yet, we can close that. I just want to point out that sometimes when you initially start doing things, you might wonder, like, why don't I see anything in my render? And that's because Arnold requires you to actually create a light, right? Arnold has its own special type of lights. So we don't create these lights that are in the lighting thing. We don't use, actually Arnold has its own tab. So that's interesting. We do have, if you wanted to use the tabs and are more icon focused, you do have the render scene and the Arnold render view tabs right here that we can use if you want to set that up. And then the different lights I'm going to be talking about are right here too. But I'm generally going to be going through the menu, which I think is always a good idea at first when you're learning what's there, because a lot of times what's in the tab is just a subset of what's in the menus, right? So we have these different types of lights. We're going to get to the physical sky and the sky dome light to do massive outside scenes and HDRI imagery and all that kind of stuff. I'll talk about the photometric and the light portal. We'll probably mess with a mesh light, especially if we're going to do indoor lights. We're going to start off with an area light. All right, what an area light is, go ahead and click that to create a light. And you'll see this, you'll see this little, I'm actually going to move into my perspective view instead of my camera view so I can move around like they're about the same right now. I'm going to my perspective view so I can move around without moving my camera. But I can see that the light is actually pointing in a direction. It's got one normal that's pointing out like that. Now, by default, this area light, this is the way like a traditional indoor light would work, okay? And the biggest difference with Arnold is that this is a physically correct light so that it doesn't just point in a direction forever. It does have a fall off. Some of the other lights like the point light and the spotlight do have fall offs, but this usually starts at a very, very low level, and you've usually got to dial it up because at some level with these lights, if I have my area light selected, there is just a lot of different settings to set up these lights, different ways that you can kind of match them to be actual physical lights. Like there's ways that you can import like light maps and things like that to be able to kind of say, this is this specific indoor light that I want to use. It's pretty interesting. But anyway, if we set our scene to, I guess I'll go back to my camera view. If we set our scene to actually render with lighting by hitting the 7 key, you can see that it's barely on. In fact, if I open the Arnold render view and let it render. Well, I have to actually click render, I guess, that open. I'm barely getting like a tiny little something from this torus by default. All right, so I need to ramp this light's intensity and or exposure up. So these are the two main ones. Won't worry about the color yet, but the intensity and the exposure represent how, how strong it is. So if I start to dial up the intensity, you can see that start to light some more things up. If I start to dial up the exposure, you can see that start to light things up. I'm going to leave the exposure at 0 and just dial the intensity way up to like 5. I'm not seeing much effect on my scene. I'm going to see if I render if that. Okay, so it's not really showing me what's happening on the walls, but when I render, I can see that, okay, as I turn it up, I am getting some splash on that wall a little bit. So maybe if I bring the exposure up, dial these things way up, see it start to blow out. All right, so very quickly it starts to get blown out and have a little too much. But as I dial those way up, you can see that the way Arnold renders is different than the way the software renders. The software render just has blue squares and will reveal like the main render. What this does is go in a series of sequences. All right, so you can see it's building around. It starts with a very rough pixelated view, and then it will slowly render into a less pixelated view. And finally, when it finishes, this is the final rendering. The final rendering is still very pixelated, pointillated, but that's just because we have the quality settings pretty far down here. Now, what's happening with this, I can see that, yeah, as I jack it way up, like I shouldn't have to put the exposure that high, I can see what's probably happening is the light is sitting in the middle of my torus. And because it's a physically correct light, a lot of it's being trapped in there. So it's just completely washed out inside here. And whatever's bouncing off the torus is finally making its way out into the room. But just the fact that we only have one light pointing in one direction and it's getting to these other places is pretty incredible. So what we want to do is rotate and move this light around. I'm going to go back to setting the intensity to 1 and the exposure to 0, which was barely giving me this. And I'm going to rotate my light around. So I'm going to grab the rotation tool, and I'm going to make this little thing, not that way, grab the red axis. I want to make this thing point down, all right? And then maybe I'm going to move it. In fact, I am going to go into my 4-up view so I can use my actual perspective view. I'm going to move this light up towards the top of the box. Take care not to go out the top. I'm looking at this view. Because if it's out of the top, all of a sudden I probably won't see anything, so hit the top of it. But if I have it pointing down at the defaults, I can see in my camera view that it is lighting this ever so slightly. If I render this, well, I keep opening the render view and then having to actually click the render button. All right, so I'm really not seeing anything, but that's because it's rendering the front. Okay, I need to right click in my camera view and do it. No, I'm still doing that. I need to take it back over. There we go. All right, so very barely can see it. Now that it's pointing down though, maybe I'll ramp things up a little bit. So maybe I'll bring the intensity. Let's blow the intensity all the way up to 10, render it again. And now I can at least start to see the scenes start to come together here. And maybe I will slowly start to bring the exposure up. Try and bring it up to 1 instead of 0. Now, one thing to notice is as I make these changes, when I have the Arnold render view open, it will automatically start rendering without you having to hit the render button every time, which is really cool. So now I'll set this to 2, and as soon as I do that, it starts to ramp that up, all right? And then maybe I'll even blow it up a little more, go to 3. All right, so now I'm starting to fill, I'm getting quite a big, quite a highlight on my cube here, but I'm starting to see the rest of the room fill out. And notice also that without having to turn anything, we have shadows going on. With the software render, we had to turn on either shadow maps or depth map shadows or ray tracing shadows. But with Arnold, when we use a photorealistic light, the shadows, the caustics, the refractions, the reflections, all that stuff is part of the renderer. And it's all just one big mathematical algorithmic simulation, all right? And you can see that even though our quality is set kind of low, first of all, with just a single light, with no materials or anything, before with the other renderer, it was taking 1 second, maybe 2 seconds. This took almost 30 seconds. So literally 30 times longer, for rendering time. Now, it's not that big of a deal when we're sitting here 30 seconds here, 30 seconds there. But when we're trying to render a sequence and 10 seconds times 30 frames a second is 300 frames, and rendering 300 frames times, you know, imagine if it takes an hour to render one frame, 300 hours. We don't have that kind of time, right? So we're gonna have to find a happy medium of quality so we actually have time to render all the frames that we have to. But just notice, without adding any materials, without adding anything into this except for just blowing up the intensity and exposure of a single area light, notice, even though it's like pixely in certain spots, notice how much more just interesting and realistic and soft all of these edges are. First off, notice the cube is actually smoothed. In all of our other renderings, that was just a flat cube because the Arnold render recognizes that Maya mesh smoothing and the other one doesn't. So that's a really big deal. And you can see even across this, you know, across any of these edges, this side one or this front one, you can see that really, really soft kind of contour of the light there. Even down into the corners of the rooms, you can see how ever so slightly, like the shadows, which they do in real life with both ray traced and depth map shadows with the software renderer, they're just hard edged. And there's no such thing as hard edged shadows in real life. When you look down at your shadow in real life, it gets slowly more light as you get away from it, right? As it gets further away. So that takes all of these little things into consideration, and even just the subtlety again in the corners of being able to see, you know, how this is actually physically bouncing light all around the way it needs to. So now let's see if we can clean this area up, right? So before we even get on to using other materials or lights or anything like that, let's see how we can get this to look a little bit more realistic. Because you can see this isn't perfect because, okay, why do we have all these crappy things down here, right? Well, the reason is we have several different places to increase the quality of the sampling and the render, which, you know, completely increases the render time. And again, I'm going to beat that to death. One thing that's really cool is here. Let me open up the render settings. And in the render settings with the Arnold renderer, with common, it's pretty much the same stuff. That, you know, what's the file I want to save, where I want to save it, you know, all that kind of stuff. But then there's these other, we're not going to deal with these three in this class, but the Arnold renderer, the default sampling. Now this doesn't have like a production, you know, a draft, doesn't have these presets. It'd be nice if they did, but instead there's just a couple of these effects kind of dials that we need to worry about, and it's really these. So it starts off with these 3s and 2s. Now notice this was 29 seconds. We've got this certain amount of detail that looks pretty good, but there's quite a bit where it's still kind of pointillated or pixelated. I say pointillated because they're not actually pixels, they're little points of light that are just not being detailed enough with the calculations and taking enough time to make them look smooth. So to try and make this look as smooth as possible, we ramp this up. And as we ramp this up, our time is going to go up. So let's try just doubling these. So if I go from 6, and notice as soon as I start changing these, and I'll change all these to 4s, which we might not even go this high, but every time I make a change, it automatically starts re-rendering. That's what that IPR was that I was talking about in the other renderer. It's a way to say, hey, every time I make a change, keep rendering. Well, you don't even have to do that with Arnold because it just automatically does it. So as this is rendering, you can see that it's only 3% right now, 4%. So we're actually going to wait a couple of minutes. But within the first 3%, it made a very rough version, right? So a lot of times you may like, oh, that's not working. I might want to go tweak something or change something. Like if I were to rotate my camera, notice that it actually changes in the render view. It's badass. It doesn't do that with the software view. If I were to move something around, it updates and it's constantly rendering and constantly trying to keep up with you. Now, I just jacked up my camera view. I want it back to the way it goes, so I'm going to use those bracket keys. I'm going to hit twice to undo my last 2 camera movements. And now this gets me back to this nice, interesting view. And I like this view because I can see the shadows of these things coming down onto the floor and the wall because the light is above them. But if I were to move the light around, if I were to do anything, it's going to automatically update. So it's pretty cool because very quickly you can kind of see general effect. And then as it slowly starts to build, you'll see that this looks like it's going through All right, I'll show you the samples here at the bottom. I'm gonna change this one more time, start it over. So I redo my last camera. Notice it says samples, very quickly it says 1s and 2s down there before it kicks to the 6s and 4s. I'll set it back. And what it does is it only takes about 2 seconds to render this version, which is at that sample rate. And now it's doing this sample rate, which we set as our final sample rate, and that's gonna slowly pick through and see these little boxes will start to clean up. And we'll sit here and wait for it, and we'll watch it build. We'll do this a couple of times here, but notice in particular the problem areas, right? Like I could have saved a snapshot while this is happening. I'm not gonna do it right now, but this little icon down here, this little snapshot thing, that will let you have a tray of renderings down here, just like we were scrolling through before, that lets you compare. And that's really important because, as you're setting up your scene, there'll be a lot of test renders, but at some point you're gonna want to decide like what is the quality that you want versus the time it takes to render and how much time do you actually have to get it done. But you can see how this is coming out. I mean, we're still gonna wait for it just to illustrate how long it takes to go from draft quality to production quality. But I will show you in a moment how we can render only a portion. So if you're just trying to clean a certain part up, you could play with it. But you can see this main area here is pretty much already done, and it's a lot better than it was. In fact, I want to keep an eye over here as this cleans up. But this is rendered, but you can still see the little points on it, right? Like you could ramp this up even more and have it take even more time, and it'll get even smoother. And it'll definitely be, an art form for us to find these right values for which, what quality versus the time that we have to render. I know I keep saying that, but it's so important when you're using art, because really when you see the results you can get and how quick the setup is and compared to traditional lighting, I would always use Arnold. Like it's just the photorealism. We haven't even put materials on yet. And this has so much more depth than that other view did, even when we were adding all kinds of things to it. But just the rendering can be a killer. And I'm working on a laptop. I've got a Mac Pro from 2014. It's probably older than anybody else's machine. Newer one might render a little faster. But when you talk about like a studio, even if it's a smaller studio, you're typically going to have some kind of render farm set up, which would be like big, desktop stand-up computers. There's even render farm like services online. You can upload your files and pay a fee, and they'll put you into your render farm and do your renders. So there's a lot of different ways to handle it. But just as a student project, as an indie 3D artist, you'll really want to get a handle on kind of the complexities and ups and downs of render time with Arnold, because again, check out the shadow now. Like if you look really close, you can see it's not perfect. It looks a little worse over here than it does in the shadow. So it could be ramped up even a little more. But in comparison to the shadows you get with non-physical lighting, I mean, the way it's just darker and gets lighter and fades out and has all these interesting shapes as part of it, it's another level, really. It used to be that 3D artists would spend a lot of time trying to fake these kinds of effects with all kinds of lights in the scene, and this object is accepting shadows from this light but isn't from this light, and really trying to get that look. But with physical lighting, there's a lot less setup. All right, that finished, and it took 4 minutes and 52 seconds to render one scene. So basically 5 minutes, and we don't even have any materials, and it's not even like super high quality. But this is the biggest thing, is like the trade-off of how awesome this looks before we've done anything to just slap a light up there. I mean, we only have one light also. We had to set up 3-point lighting before to even get a little bit of depth. And now what this is doing is literally working like a real physical light would, and it's bouncing all over the scene, doing all kinds of crazy things. I'm gonna save my scene here, all right? And then for now, I'm gonna go back to dialed down level. In fact, I'm just gonna go to 2 and 1s here. The default was a 3 at the camera and then 2s for everything else. I'm gonna go down to 2 and then 1s for everything else, just to really make it basic and make this go fast to see some differences. All right, now, whoops, I guess if I move the render view, it also re-renders. But that rendered in See how long it takes. About 9 seconds, so that's more realistic to see something. But you know, when things take so long to render, a lot of times when you're just tweaking with lighting or something, you're just working, even if you're just trying to find like that right level of detail that you would need for a specific area to look good, you can render a region. So in this scene, I'd say that this area right here on the torus is the ugliest area that we'd have to get the most kind of sampling details to get working. This little box right here I can click on, and I can just select one area that now, no matter what I do, if I ramp this up to 6s and 3s now, that took 5 minutes to render the entire scene last time, or no, was it 6s and 3s or was it 4s? I don't remember, I'll set it to 4s, regardless. All right, now it's only rendering within this one little box, all right? Now, even though, maybe I will set these to 3s, I don't want to blow it up completely. It's still setting it 0. I probably won't wait for the whole thing. I'm just going to wait and see it start to block together. But this shouldn't take an entire 5 minutes. It should only take, okay, that's done already. So that took 11 seconds instead of 5 minutes to do the entire thing. But I can see that this is the level of detail that it was, taking 5 full minutes to render the whole scene versus 11 seconds just to play with this detail. So then maybe I want to ramp these up even more. Maybe I'll bring this up to 8 and these up to 6s and see like really how high do I have to go before I don't see any kind of point-elated light there. We'll see if within a minute or so this will even render this little chunk. Looks like possibly with the render region, I'm not sure that this is actually functioning. Or maybe it's going really slow trying to get that. I can see, yeah, I can see one little square added right here. Give it a minute and see if a couple more start filling in. So moral of the story is it's very easy to dial these up too high and really start blowing things up. All right, so it's starting to come together now. But if this takes up to a minute, I mean, it could take a half hour or an hour to actually render the entire scene with this high of detail. Yeah, it looks like this is, it's kind of working, but it was only going up to 5%. So this must only be about 5% of the whole thing. But now if I look at it, I mean, I can actually still see a little bit of that detail. But that's where if you were like a full-fledged photorealistic, you know, 4K render that's got motion blur and all kinds of crazy effects and things, like your rendering power needs to be pretty significant, right? So you just need to be realistic about what you can do with a laptop when it comes to these types of rendering times. So that took a whole minute. This might take a half hour or an hour to do the whole scene, and we haven't even added materials yet. So that's really the very, very basics of Arnold. Is first of all, once you've got it installed, you have to add an Arnold light of some kind. And the physical lights, like the area light, definitely emit light in a certain degree that you may need to ramp up or down depending on your scene size. If you had a really microscopic scene, that might have started out too huge. It's just physical, so you've got to set them in the right way. Is rendering time determined by a computer's GPU? It is a combination. Typically, yes, it is from your graphics card. Typically. I say typically because CPU is also involved. But for the most part, if you have a beefed up like super gamer's graphic card, usually, I mean, a gamer graphic card is one thing, but a 3D artist graphic card is usually like the tippity top end of gamer graphics cards for this exact reason. But seeing this render view, seeing how just default without turning anything on, this would, if these were different materials, we'll play with this shortly, but this would actually reflect and refract and do all of those ray tracing things without you having to turn anything on. It's just naturally photorealistic. And even just the curvature and the softness of this shadow here, like there's just so much going on. It's really, really impressive. So I'm going to go back to basically, I'll say 3 and 2s, which I believe is the default that it sets at, which the default is a very reasonable time. It doesn't look great, right? And then I think I can just click this and unclick it, and now we'll go back to doing all of this. So again, really cool that even if I adjust the lights, it's always going to kind of update and just always be rendering. All right, so let's take a look at a couple other default lights here. So I'm going to close this for now. How about I get rid of my area light? I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to create a mesh light. And if you see Arnold lights, a mesh light I have this torus selected, I should actually be able to make this torus a light. So I just selected my torus and added a mesh light. I haven't done anything else. I'm gonna open my render view and render it, and I can barely see anything. I can see a little more of my viewport than the render view than I can see that's just lighting the bottom of these. So I probably need to ramp it up. So I'm gonna ramp up the intensity. Now the intensity only goes as high as 10. Any of these sliders in Maya, if I decide, you know what, I want my intensity to be 100, screw you slider, I can type in 100, and now all of a sudden the slider readjusts to be between 0 and 200. So you can go higher than these slider values a lot. I'm gonna go back down to 10. It looks like it's lighting up a little more. Okay, so if I render, I can see it's starting to light up a bit more of the scene here. I'm gonna bring up the exposure seems to, and I'm gonna leave my render view open so I can see in real time, because as I can see, the render view just is showing me more. I'm not really getting any of the bouncing around, any of that. That's what's being calculated, right? That in real time, I can see how the light's kind of bouncing off the objects, but I'm not seeing how it's bouncing, you know, with all these caustics and all these other waves. So now if I start to ramp up the exposure, that usually seems to brighten things up pretty quickly, right? So I did a intensity of 10, an exposure of 5. Now notice how by default, the fact that I created a light out of that, it disappeared from the scene, right? And Maya just assumes that if you create a default light, then if you create a mesh light, then you don't want to see it. But that's not necessarily the case. So what we can is we can check this light visible thing, and now we can see this super bright light in the scene. See if I dial it back to the default, is it always super bright, or is it just because we have it all blown up? Okay, well, it's still just a little mark like that. But if this was like at the top of the room, exposure back up, and maybe I wanted to actually move this light up. Again, it's just super cool to see the render view automatically update for you. So now that I move this above, and I can see that you can just create a light out of any objects. You can literally model light bulbs and turn them on and make them lights and make them shine through. And there's a lot of different, you know, shadow density, the actual color of the shadow, some basics about the volume and the way it bounces and things like that. But for the most part, you can keep the default and just mess with the intensity, exposure, and color. Now, what we'll want to see though, I'll show you here in a moment, is the skylight, the physical skylight. But even more than that, the image-based lighting gives you even better of a lighting situation, because it can use the image to generate shadows and reflections and refractions. And even though this is more interesting, there's another level we can get to with using image-based lighting, and that's what we're going to get into. So as you can see though, those are the two basics that we use. We use an area light. You can just put a 3D light in, like a traditional light, and just put it somewhere. It doesn't show up in the scene. You can make any mesh light of any size, any shape, anything. You can have it show up in the scene or not. If I turn the light's visibility off, it doesn't change the way it actually lights the scene. Everything's kind of done automatically for you. You do have to deal with the sampling and kind of play with the whole rendering time. That gets very significant, but as you can already see, the quality is worth it. So looking at a couple of the other types of lights, the sky dome and the physical sky, we'll take a look at. Photometric light, that is a light that you can see, like a volumetric light. I believe that's their version of the Maya's volumetric light, where it would be like as if you were to turn on a flashlight. You want to be able to see the actual beam of light, see some kind of dust and particles and effects and whatnot within the light. You'd use a photometric light. A light portal, what this is, it's a way to use the standard outside lighting and set up a lighting portal on a window, and it will kind of make the light flood in and fill up the indoor scene as if it's being lit from outdoor sunlight, which is pretty awesome.